The warden stepped out of his office and called for complete silence in the briefing room. Every detective, federal agent, and corrections officer turned to look at the woman walking quietly behind him, carrying nothing but a simple notepad. 3 months ago, they had assigned her to meal service and maximum security. Now she was about to deliver intelligence that would crack a case that had stumped them all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Correctional Complex stretched across 47 acres of Illinois farmland, its concrete walls rising like gray monuments against the morning sky. Steam drifted from the industrial kitchen's exhaust vents, carrying the institutional smell of mass-produced meals and industrial disinfectant that permeated every corner of the facility. The main corridor echoed with the rhythmic clang of metal doors, the shuffle of regulation footwear, and the low hum of conversations conducted in careful, measured tones. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the service entrance at exactly 5:30 a.m. Her worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder and a thermos of coffee clutched in her free hand. The security checkpoint guard barely glanced up from his newspaper as she swiped her ID card through the reader. The magnetic strip had started to fade from repeated use, requiring 2 swipes before the light turned green and the turnstile clicked open. She had arrived at Riverside through the same bureaucratic maze that processed all civilian contractors. Her application had moved through 3 different departments, collecting signatures and stamps from administrators who viewed food service personnel as necessary but unremarkable components of prison operations. The hiring manager had conducted her interview in exactly 12 minutes, asking standard questions about food safety certification and availability for weekend shifts. Kitchen work, he had explained while stamping her paperwork with practiced efficiency. Meal prep, serving, cleanup, nothing complicated. Follow the procedures, stay out of trouble, collect your paycheck. His tone carried the weary resignation of someone who had processed hundreds of similar applications, expecting nothing more than basic competence and reliable attendance. The employee orientation session had been conducted in a windowless conference room by a corrections supervisor who read directly from a 3-ring binder. Safety protocols, emergency procedures, and interaction guidelines delivered in a monotone that suggested the information was important primarily for liability purposes. Sarah had listened carefully, taking notes in precise handwriting while her 19 fellow trainees dozed or checked their phones. Inmates are to be addressed by their last names and identification numbers only, the supervisor had read from page 47 of the manual. Conversations should be limited to essential operational communication. Report any unusual behavior or requests immediately to supervising officers. The emphasis on following established protocols left no room for interpretation or individual initiative. Her first assignment placed her in the maximum security dining hall, a cavernous space dominated by bolted-down metal tables and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across concrete floors. The serving line stretched along one wall, protected by reinforced plexiglass barriers that allowed food transfer through narrow slots, while maintaining separation between staff and inmates. The kitchen supervisor, Frank Rodriguez, had 32 years of correctional experience and the particular brand of cynicism that developed from watching the same patterns repeat endlessly. He assigned workstations with military precision, placing newer employees in positions that minimized their contact with inmates, while ensuring experienced staff maintained oversight of all interactions. "You'll handle vegetables and starches," he informed Sarah, pointing toward the steam tables that held massive aluminum containers of institutional food. "Keep the portions consistent, maintain the serving temperature, and don't engage in conversation beyond what's necessary for portion requests." His instructions were delivered with the flat efficiency of someone who had learned that detailed explanations were usually wasted on temporary employees. The other food service workers had formed their own informal hierarchy based on seniority, and institutional knowledge. Maria Santos, who had worked kitchen duty for 8 years, occupied the position closest to the main serving window where she could monitor the entire operation. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her rapid-fire Spanish commentary provided running analysis of every situation that developed during meal service. "New girl gets the vegetable station," she announced to the assembled staff with obvious amusement. "Let's see how long this one lasts before she requests a transfer to minimum security." Her comment drew chuckles from coworkers who had witnessed numerous civilian employees discover that maximum security meal service required more resilience than they had initially anticipated. Tommy Chun, a 23-year-old community college graduate who viewed kitchen work as temporary employment, while he studied for law enforcement exams, shook his head with practiced superiority. Civilians never understand the psychology of dealing with maximum security inmates. These guys can smell weakness from across the serving line, and they'll test every new face that shows up. An older employee, Janet Williams, adjusted her hairnet and checked the temperature logs with weary experience. "Best advice I can give you is keep your head down, follow the routine exactly, and don't take anything personally. Some of these inmates have been playing mind games longer than you've been alive." Sarah absorbed these warnings without comment, understanding that skepticism about her durability was simply part of the institutional culture. She arranged her workstation methodically, positioning serving spoons for maximum efficiency and checking that backup containers remained at proper temperature. Her movements were deliberate and economical, suggesting someone accustomed to working in environments where attention to detail mattered. The first inmates began entering the dining hall at exactly 11:45 a.m., moving through the serving line with practiced efficiency that reflected years of institutional routine. They wore identical orange uniforms and maintained careful spacing that minimized contact while maximizing their ability to observe everything happening around them. Conversations occurred in low tones, coded language, and meaningful glances that conveyed information without attracting attention from supervising officers. Sarah served vegetables and starches with consistent portions and professional neutrality, making no attempt to engage beyond acknowledging portion requests. The inmates studied her with obvious curiosity, noting her composed demeanor and systematic approach to unfamiliar work. Several made casual comments designed to provoke reactions, but she responded only when direct questions required operational answers. "Fresh meat in the kitchen," observed Marcus Henderson, a career criminal serving his 3rd consecutive sentence. "Wonder how long before she figures out this ain't regular food service." His comment was directed toward other inmates rather than Sarah herself, but delivered loudly enough to ensure she could hear his assessment. By the end of her first week, the consensus among both staff and inmates was that Sarah Mitchell would likely complete her probationary period without incident, but probably wouldn't develop into anything more than another competent but unremarkable addition to the food service. Rotation. She seemed pleasant enough, followed procedures correctly, and showed no signs of the naivety that sometimes led civilian employees into problematic situations with manipulative inmates. What none of them noticed was that she remembered every conversation she heard, recognized patterns in seemingly random comments, and had begun to understand that the dining hall served as much more than a place for institutional meal service. Information flowed through that space with the same regularity as the scheduled meal delivery, and someone who knew how to listen carefully might discover that maximum security inmates possessed knowledge that extended far beyond the prison walls. 3 weeks into Sarah's employment, Detective Ray Kowalski from the Illinois State Police sat across from Warden James Crawford in an office that overlooked the prison's central courtyard. Case files spread across the mahogany desk told the story of a drug trafficking operation that had frustrated law enforcement for 8 months. Despite raids, wiretaps, and informant networks, the distribution chain remained intact, moving product through channels that seem to anticipate every investigative move. The Alvarez organization has built something we've never seen before, Kowalski explained, tapping a photograph of Elena Alvarez, a 34-year-old woman whose legitimate businesses provided perfect cover for narcotics trafficking. Every time we get close, they shift operations to a completely different territory. They're getting intelligence about our investigations faster than we can develop leads. Crawford studied the surveillance photos that showed known associates visiting inmates at Riverside. The pattern was obvious but legally meaningless. These visitors maintained perfect behavior during monitored visits, discussed only family matters and legal proceedings, and never violated any regulation that would justify restricting their access. Yet within days of their visits, law enforcement operations would encounter unexpected obstacles or find their targets had vanished. Miguel Santos has been here for 2 years, Crawford said, pointing to an inmate photograph clipped to the case file. Conspiracy to distribute, originally part of the Alvarez network. His brother visits monthly, along with various cousins and family friends. All documented, all approved, all completely clean according to our monitoring systems. The challenge frustrated everyone involved in the investigation. Prison visits occurred in designated areas under direct supervision, with conversations recorded and reviewed by trained personnel who understood criminal communication patterns. Phone calls were monitored and analyzed for coded language. Mail was inspected and copied before delivery. Yet somehow, information continued flowing between the incarcerated members of the organization and their associates operating in the outside. World FBI Special Agent Lisa Thompson had joined the task force 6 weeks earlier, bringing expertise in organized crime communications. Her analysis of recorded conversations had revealed sophisticated techniques for embedding information in seemingly innocent discussions about family events, medical appointments, and neighborhood gossip. The criminals had developed a system that operated within the boundaries of monitored prison communication while maintaining operational security that protected their activities. They're using a substitution cipher based on family relationships and calendar references, Thompson explained, spreading transcripts across the conference table. When Miguel's brother mentions that Aunt Rosa's arthritis is acting up on Tuesdays, he's actually reporting that law enforcement surveillance has increased in the Northside distribution territory. When they discuss Cousin Danny's job at the auto shop, they're coordinating delivery schedules. The sophistication of the communication system suggested coordination by someone with extensive experience in both criminal operations and institutional security procedures. Breaking the cipher required understanding not just the language patterns, but the cultural and family references that provided context for the coded messages. Traditional surveillance methods had proven inadequate against an organization that had learned to exploit the necessary communication channels that connected inmates to their families and legal representatives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Previous attempts to develop intelligence through conventional sources had failed consistently. Prison informants either lacked access to high-level organizational discussions or were identified and neutralized before they could provide useful information. Undercover operations had proven impossible in the tightly controlled environment of maximum security, where every new face attracted immediate attention and suspicion. The Department of Corrections had implemented additional security measures that succeeded only in making communication more subtle rather than stopping it entirely. Extended monitoring of visits had revealed nothing beyond the already identified cipher patterns. Restricting visitor privileges had triggered legal challenges while producing no additional intelligence. The Alvarez organization had adapted to every countermeasure by developing more sophisticated methods that operated within legal boundaries. We need someone who can get close enough to hear unmonitored conversations, Kowalski admitted during a strategy session that had stretched past midnight. These inmates trust no one in uniform, and they can identify law enforcement officers regardless of cover. But there might be opportunities with civilian staff who have routine access to areas where inmates feel comfortable talking. The idea faced immediate skepticism from corrections professionals who understood the dangers of involving untrained civilians in intelligence operations. Inmates were skilled at identifying and exploiting anyone who showed unusual interest in their activities. Previous attempts to use civilian staff as informal informants had resulted in compromised employees, security breaches, and violence that endangered both the targets and other personnel throughout the facility. Crawford pulled personnel files for civilian employees who had regular contact with maximum security inmates. The list was shorter than expected. Most civilian contractors worked in areas with minimal inmate contact, while those who did interact with prisoners typically held specialized positions, requiring extensive background investigations and security training that made them obvious targets for suspicion. Food service personnel represented the largest category of civilian staff with routine access to maximum security inmates. Kitchen workers, serving staff, and cleaning crews moved through areas where inmates gathered and conversated with relative freedom during meal periods. However, the structured nature of meal service limited opportunities for extended observation, while the presence of multiple corrections officers made inmates careful about discussing sensitive topics. The dining hall conversations are mostly complaints about food quality, requests for additional portions, and general griping about facility conditions, reported Sergeant Patricia Hayes, who supervised meal service security. These guys know. We're watching and listening. They save important discussions for their cells, the yard, or work assignments where they have more privacy. The challenge of developing human intelligence within maximum security had stumped law enforcement agencies for decades. Inmates existed within a social structure that punished cooperation with authorities through violence that could extend to family members outside the prison. Even inmates who harbored no loyalty to criminal organizations understood that survival depended on maintaining the code of silence that protected everyone from retaliation. Thompson proposed a different approach that focused on passive observation rather than active intelligence gathering. Instead of recruiting informants who would ask questions and seek specific information, they could position trained observers in locations where natural conversations occurred. The key was finding personnel who could listen effectively without appearing to show unusual interest in inmate discussions. "We need someone who blends into the institutional background," she explained. Someone inmates would ignore because they pose no obvious threat and serve no law enforcement function. Kitchen staff, maintenance workers, cleaning crews, people who become invisible because they're part of the daily routine that inmates take for granted. The approach required identifying civilian employees who possessed both the opportunity for observation and the intelligence to recognize significant information when they encountered it. Most importantly, they needed someone who could maintain perfect operational security while gathering intelligence that might take weeks or months to develop into actionable leads. Crawford reviewed the files of current civilian staff, looking for individuals who might possess the combination of access, intelligence, and discretion necessary for such a sensitive operation. The requirements seemed contradictory. They needed someone competent enough to recognize important intelligence, but unremarkable enough to avoid attracting attention from highly suspicious maximum security inmates. As he flipped through employment records, one name caught his attention for reasons he couldn't immediately identify. Sarah Mitchell had been hired through routine channels for basic food service duties, but her application showed educational background and work experience that seemed inconsistent with seeking employment in prison kitchen operations. Her references were impeccable. Her background investigation had revealed no concerning associations, and her early performance evaluations indicated competence that exceeded normal expectations for entry-level positions. What made her file interesting was not what it contained, but what it seemed to avoid explaining. Her previous employment showed gaps that suggested periods of specialized work or education that weren't fully documented in standard hiring paperwork. Her references provided enthusiastic endorsements of her character and reliability, but offered few specific details about the nature of her previous responsibilities. Most intriguingly, preliminary reports from kitchen supervisors mentioned that inmates seemed comfortable conversing in her presence, treating her as background personnel rather than potential security threat. In a facility where inmates carefully modulated their behavior around any staff member who might report their activities, such casual acceptance was unusual and potentially valuable. Sarah had developed a routine that went unnoticed by everyone except the inmates themselves. While other kitchen staff focused on maintaining serving schedules and portion control, she had begun paying attention to the rhythm of conversations that flowed around the dining hall. Not the words themselves, but the patterns of who spoke, to whom, when discussions intensified or died away, and how information seemed to move through the room like water finding its level. During the Tuesday lunch service, she noticed that Carlos Mendez always positioned himself at the third table, from the serving line, where he could observe both the kitchen staff and the corrections officers stationed near the entrance. His conversations appeared casual, discussing sports scores and commissary prices with rotating groups of inmates who joined his table for precisely calculated periods before moving to other locations throughout the dining hall. The pattern became clearer over several weeks of observation. Inmates would approach Mendez's table, engage in brief conversations about seemingly mundane topics, then disperse to different areas where they would initiate similar discussions with other inmates. The information flow resembled a sophisticated relay system, with each participant carrying pieces of larger communications that would be assembled elsewhere in the facility. Sarah began to understand that the dining hall functioned as a communications hub where inmates could gather intelligence, coordinate activities, and maintain connections with associates throughout the facility. The structured nature of meal service provided perfect cover for information exchange, while the presence of multiple corrections officers actually facilitated the process by creating a sense of security that encouraged conversation. Her position at the vegetable station offered an optimal vantage point for observing these interactions without appearing to show interest in inmate activities. She could monitor the serving line, track movement patterns throughout the dining hall, and listen to conversations that occurred near her workstation. Most importantly, inmates had begun treating her as part of the institutional background, conducting discussions in her presence without the caution they exhibited around corrections officers. The breakthrough came during a Thursday afternoon, when Miguel Santos received a visit from his cousin, Rodrigo Alvarez, nephew of the organization's leader. The visit occurred in the standard monitoring room where all conversations were recorded and supervised by corrections personnel. Sarah had no access to these proceedings, but she observed the aftermath during evening meal service when Santos returned to the dining hall with information that needed to be disseminated quickly. Santos approached Mendez's table and initiated what appeared to be a routine discussion about weekend visiting schedules. However, Sarah noticed that other inmates positioned themselves within earshot of this conversation, and several began taking notes on napkins that they later folded and disposed of in specific waste containers. The level of attention suggested that Santos was conveying information that required precise transmission to multiple recipients. "My cousin says the family reunion is definitely happening next month," Santos said while cutting his meatloaf into precise squares. "Aunt Rosa is feeling much better, and she's planning to make her special tamales for everyone who comes." His tone was conversational, but Sarah recognized that every word had been carefully chosen to convey specific meaning. Beyond its surface content, Mendez nodded thoughtfully, adding his own seemingly innocent commentary. That's good news. I hope the weather cooperates. You know how these family gatherings can get complicated when it rains. Other inmates at nearby tables paused their own conversations momentarily, suggesting they were monitoring this exchange. For information relevant to their own activities. Sarah realized she was witnessing a real-time intelligence briefing disguised as casual conversation between family members discussing social events. The sophistication impressed her, but also revealed vulnerabilities in the system that law enforcement could potentially exploit. The inmates had developed effective methods for moving information, but they relied on verbal communication that could be intercepted if someone understood the context and coding systems being employed. Over the following weeks, she began mapping the communication networks that operated throughout the dining hall. Certain inmates served as information brokers who collected intelligence from multiple sources and redistributed it to appropriate recipients. Other inmates functioned as message carriers who transported information between different sections of the facility through carefully choreographed movements during meal service. The system included built-in security measures designed to protect against infiltration and surveillance. New inmates were observed carefully before being granted access to sensitive information. Corrections officers were tracked and analyzed to identify those who might pose security risks. Even civilian staff were evaluated for their potential threat to operational security. Though most were dismissed as irrelevant to inmate concerns, Sarah's growing understanding of these communication patterns allowed her to anticipate information flows and position herself to observe key exchanges without appearing to show unusual interest. She developed techniques for appearing focused on her assigned duties while actually monitoring conversations that occurred throughout her area of responsibility. The challenge was distinguishing between routine, institutional communications and intelligence that might be relevant to ongoing criminal investigations. Inmates discussed everything from legal appeals and family problems to commissary shortages and recreational activities. Identifying information related to external criminal operations required understanding the context and relationships that gave meaning to seemingly innocent conversations. She began keeping mental notes about inmates who received regular visits from specific individuals, those who seemed to coordinate information distribution among their associates, and patterns in the timing of communications that might correspond to external events. The intelligence picture that emerged suggested an organization that maintained sophisticated command and control structures even while key members remained incarcerated. Frank Rodriguez, the kitchen supervisor, began noticing that Sarah demonstrated unusual situational awareness during meal service. She seemed to anticipate problems before they developed, position herself optimally for managing crowd flow, and maintain calm efficiency even during situations that stressed other staff members. Her performance evaluations reflected competence that exceeded expectations for someone with her limited institutional experience. Mitchell handles the pressure better than people who've been doing this job for years, Rodriguez mentioned to Warden Crawford during a routine personnel review. She reads the room like she's been working corrections her whole life. Inmates respect her, staff appreciates her reliability, and she never seems rattled by situations that typically overwhelm new employees. What Rodriguez didn't mention was that Sarah had begun asking subtle questions about inmate classification systems, visitor approval processes, and the administrative procedures that governed communication between incarcerated individuals and their families. Her inquiries appeared motivated by professional interest in understanding institutional operations, but they demonstrated knowledge of correctional systems that seemed inconsistent with basic food service employment. Maria Santos, the senior kitchen worker, noticed that inmates had begun treating Sarah differently than other civilian staff. They spoke more freely in her presence, showed her courtesy that they rarely extended to corrections officers, and seemed to trust that she posed no threat to their activities. This level of acceptance typically required months or years to develop. Yet Sarah had achieved it within weeks of beginning employment. The inmates like her, Maria observed during a staff meeting. Not in a problematic way, but they're comfortable around her. That's unusual for someone so new. It usually takes forever for maximum security inmates to accept civilian staff as part of the institutional background. Tommy Chun, still studying for law enforcement examinations, found Sarah's rapid integration puzzling. She doesn't act like other civilian contractors. Most people come in here intimidated by the environment, worried about saying the wrong thing or getting involved in situations they can't handle. She moves through this place like she understands exactly how everything works. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor while gradually expanding her knowledge of the intelligence networks that operated throughout the facility. She learned to distinguish between different types of information, recognize inmates who held positions of authority within their organizations, and identify communication patterns that might indicate planning for future criminal activities. The inmates had no reason to suspect that their casual acceptance of her presence was providing law enforcement with its first genuine intelligence breakthrough in months of frustrated investigation. They saw only a competent food service worker who minded her own business, treated them with appropriate respect, and seemed to understand the unwritten rules that governed interactions between civilian staff and maximum security prisoners. What they failed to recognize was that Sarah Mitchell possessed training and experience that made her uniquely qualified to transform their operational security vulnerability into actionable intelligence that would ultimately expose the entire network they had worked so carefully to protect. The moment that changed everything occurred during a seemingly routine morning shift change. Sarah was restocking serving utensils when she overheard a conversation between two inmates that made her blood run cold. Antonio Rivera, serving 15 years for armed robbery, was describing a conversation with his girlfriend about their daughter's school schedule. But Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. He was actually providing detailed information about armored car delivery routes that would allow external associates to plan a robbery. Little Maria starts her new class next Tuesday at the building. On Elm Street, Rivera explained to Vincent Bradley, a convicted money launderer with connections throughout Chicago's financial district. Same time every week, right after the morning activities wrap up at 10:30. The teacher always parks in the same spot, third space from the main entrance. Sarah understood that teacher referred to the armored car driver. Morning activities indicated the banking schedule, and the parking details provided tactical information for planning an ambush. She continued arranging silverware with steady hands, but her mind was racing through the implications of what she had just witnessed. This wasn't just communication about ongoing criminal operations. Rivera was facilitating an armed robbery that would put innocent people at risk and generate resources to fund the organization's expansion. The information needed to reach law enforcement immediately, but any obvious reaction would compromise her position and potentially endanger everyone in the facility. Bradley acknowledged the information with a subtle nod, then added his own contribution to the conversation. My nephew's soccer team has practice at the park near there. He mentioned they're getting new equipment delivered Thursday morning, right around 11. Expensive stuff that needs special handling. Sarah realized she was listening to coordination between different criminal enterprises operating under the umbrella of the Alvarez organization. Rivera's robbery planning was being synchronized with Bradley's money laundering activities to ensure stolen funds could be processed quickly through legitimate business channels. The sophistication staggered her. These inmates had maintained operational control over complex criminal enterprises while incarcerated in maximum security. They were planning felonies that would occur hundreds of miles away, coordinating between different criminal specialties, and doing it all through conversations that appeared to be routine family discussions. She finished her morning duties while processing the intelligence she had gathered. The armored car robbery was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 10:30 a.m. on Elm Street in Chicago. A money laundering operation would be ready to process the stolen funds through a front company that posed as a sporting goods supplier. The coordination suggested both operations were parts of a larger criminal strategy that extended far beyond what law enforcement had previously suspected. The challenge was communicating this information without revealing her role as an observer. Any unusual behavior would be noticed immediately by inmates who had survived in maximum security by remaining constantly vigilant about potential threats to their activities. She needed to maintain her cover while ensuring that innocent people weren't harmed by her failure to act on critical intelligence. During her lunch break, Sarah made a decision that violated every protocol about civilian contractor involvement in law enforcement operations. She approached Sergeant Hayes, who supervised dining hall security, and requested a private conversation about a personnel matter. Hayes agreed to meet in her office, expecting a routine discussion about scheduling or workplace concerns. "I need to report something I overheard during meal service," Sarah began carefully. Two inmates were discussing what sounded like plans for criminal activity outside the facility. "I'm not sure if it's significant, but I thought someone should know." Hayes leaned forward with immediate attention. Intelligence from civilian staff was rare, and usually involved minor rule violations or safety concerns, rather than serious criminal planning. "What exactly did you hear?" Sarah provided a detailed account of the conversation, translating the coded language into clear descriptions of the planned robbery and money laundering operation. She included specific details about timing, location, and the individuals involved, presenting the information with precision that impressed Hayes with its thoroughness and accuracy. "How did you know to interpret their conversation that way?" Hayes asked. "Most people would hear talk about school schedules and soccer practice, not recognize criminal planning." The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized she had reached the moment where maintaining her cover story would become impossible. Her ability to decode the communication revealed training and experience that couldn't be explained by basic food service employment. "I have some background in pattern recognition and communication analysis," she said carefully. "I used to work in situations where understanding hidden meanings in conversations was important." Hayes studied Sarah with new interest, recognizing that this conversation had implications beyond reporting suspected criminal activity. A civilian contractor who could decode sophisticated criminal communications represented either a significant intelligence asset or a potential security risk, depending on her actual background and motivations. "I need to bring this to the wardens' attention immediately," Hayes decided. "The information you've provided could prevent serious crimes and save lives. But we also need to discuss your background and qualifications, because what you've just demonstrated isn't typical civilian contractor capability." Within an hour, Sarah found herself in Warden Crawford's office facing a panel that included Detective Kowalski from the Illinois State Police and FBI Special Agent Thompson. The intelligence she had provided about the planned robbery was already being verified through independent sources, and initial checks confirmed that her analysis appeared accurate. "Agent Thompson has been trying to crack the Alvarez organization's communication system for months," Crawford explained. "You've just provided more actionable intelligence in one conversation than we've developed through months of recorded visits and monitored phone calls." Kowalski spread surveillance photographs across Crawford's desk, showing the same inmates Sarah had observed along with their known associates operating outside the facility. "We've been watching these connections for 8 months without understanding how they were coordinating activities. Your interpretation of their coded conversations explains how they've been staying ahead of our investigations." Sarah realized that her civilian contractor cover was over, but she also understood that revealing her actual background would create new complications. She had spent weeks developing relationships with inmates who trusted her precisely because they believed she posed no threat to their activities. Any revelation about law enforcement connections would destroy that trust and eliminate her unique position within the facility. Before we proceed further, Thompson said carefully, we need to understand exactly who you are and how you develop the skills to recognize and interpret criminal communications at this level. Your personnel file suggests food service employment, but what you've just demonstrated requires specialized training that isn't available through civilian channels. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Sarah had anticipated, but the intelligence she had gathered proved that her instincts about the facility's potential had been correct. The dining hall was indeed functioning as a command center for criminal operations that extended throughout the Midwest, and she was positioned to provide law enforcement with unprecedented access to organizational planning and coordination. My actual background is in intelligence analysis, she admitted. I've worked in situations where understanding criminal communication patterns was essential for preventing violence and protecting innocent people. I took this position because I believed civilian access to maximum security inmates might reveal intelligence that conventional law enforcement methods couldn't develop. Crawford exchanged glances with the federal agents, understanding that they had just discovered either an unauthorized intelligence operation or an individual who had taken extraordinary personal risks to gather critical information about ongoing criminal activities. Are you operating under official authorization from any law enforcement agency? Kowalski asked directly. Sarah's pause answered the question before she spoke. No. This was my own initiative based on my assessment that traditional surveillance methods weren't providing adequate intelligence about the Alvarez organization's prison-based command structure. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. A former intelligence analyst had independently infiltrated the facility, developed access to critical criminal communications, and gathered actionable intelligence that could prevent imminent violent crimes. Her methods were unauthorized and potentially dangerous, but her results exceeded anything official investigations had achieved. Thompson pulled out a secure phone to contact federal prosecutors about the planned robbery, while Kowalski began coordinating with Chicago police to establish surveillance at the target location. The intelligence Sarah had provided would need to be verified and acted upon within hours to prevent criminal activity that could result in serious harm to innocent victims. We have a situation that requires immediate decision-making, Crawford announced. We have credible intelligence about imminent criminal activity, an unauthorized civilian intelligence operation that's producing critical results, and the need to protect both public safety and ongoing investigations. What happened next would determine whether Sarah Mitchell's extraordinary gamble would be recognized as an intelligence breakthrough or treated as a dangerous breach of security protocols that endangered everyone involved. The secure conference room filled with tension as Warden Crawford made the decision that would either validate Sarah's unauthorized operation or expose the facility to unprecedented risk. We're going to give you official authorization to continue gathering intelligence, he announced, but under strict supervision and with full documentation of everything you discover. Agent Thompson had spent the past hour coordinating with Chicago law enforcement to verify Sarah's intelligence about the planned armored car robbery. The preliminary surveillance confirmed her analysis was accurate. Known associates of the Alvarez organization had been conducting reconnaissance at the exact location she had identified, using methods that matched the tactical information discussed in the coded conversation. The robbery team is already in position, Thompson reported, via secure phone. Chicago PD has eyes on 3 suspects who match the descriptions of individuals connected to Rivera's outside network. They're waiting for our authorization to move in, but they need confirmation that our intelligence is solid. Detective Kowalski pulled up files on his laptop showing the financial network that Sarah had identified through Bradley's coded references. Treasury agents have been investigating the sporting goods company for months, without understanding its connection to the Alvarez organization. Your analysis of the money laundering coordination gives us the missing pieces we need to build a comprehensive case. Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of briefing federal agents and corrections administrators about criminal operations she had discovered through unauthorized intelligence gathering. The surreal nature of the situation was amplified by the fact that she was still wearing her food service uniform while providing analysis that could reshape the entire investigation. "There's something else you need to understand," she said, pulling a small notebook from her pocket. "The conversations I've been monitoring suggest this robbery is just one component of a much larger operation plan for this week. Miguel Santos has been coordinating with at least 6 different inmates who maintain connections to criminal enterprises throughout the Midwest." She opened the notebook to reveal detailed notes about communication patterns, coded references, and organizational structures that she had been documenting over weeks of careful observation. The information was organized with professional precision, showing relationship diagrams, timeline analysis, and cross-referenced intelligence that demonstrated the scope of criminal coordination occurring within the facility. "How did you develop this level of detail without being detected?" Crawford asked, studying diagrams that showed information flow between different inmate groups and their external associates. "I realized that inmates had classified me as an institutional background," Sarah explained. "They talk freely in my presence because they believe food service staff pose no intelligence threat. I've been able to map their entire communication network by simply listening carefully to conversations that occur during routine meal service." Agent Thompson studied the organizational chart that Sarah had constructed, recognizing criminal enterprises that federal investigators had been tracking independently without understanding their connections to the Alvarez organization. "This shows a level of coordination we never suspected. They're not just running independent operations, they've created a consortium that shares intelligence, resources, and tactical support." The breakthrough moment came when Sarah described a conversation she had overheard that morning between Santos and 3 other inmates. The discussion had appeared to focus on basketball scores and television programming, but her analysis revealed it was actually a comprehensive briefing about law enforcement surveillance activities, court scheduling, and witness protection relocations. "Santos received a visit yesterday from his attorney," Sarah explained. "But the attorney also represents 2 other defendants in related cases, which allows him to carry information between different parts of the organization without violating attorney-client privilege." The basketball scores were actually reports about grand jury proceedings, and the television schedule was providing updates about witness testimony. Kowalski leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "We've been investigating individual criminal enterprises without understanding they were all connected through this prison-based coordination system. No wonder our operations kept getting compromised. They were sharing intelligence about our investigations faster than we could develop leads." Crawford made the decision that would put Sarah's unofficial operation on official status. "I'm authorizing you to continue intelligence gathering under federal oversight. Agent Thompson will provide you with recording equipment and communication protocols, but you'll maintain your food service position as cover for the operation." The plan required careful coordination to avoid compromising Sarah's unique position while ensuring that critical intelligence reached law enforcement agencies before criminals could act on their plans. She would continue working her regular schedule, but with backup systems to document conversations and emergency protocols to prevent violent crimes when imminent threats were identified. "The inmates trust you because they believe you're harmless," Thompson explained while briefing Sarah on the technical equipment she would use. "That trust is your greatest asset, but it's also extremely fragile. Any change in your behavior routine could expose the operation and put you in serious danger." The immediate challenge was preventing the armored car robbery while protecting Sarah's cover. Chicago police couldn't simply arrest the suspects without revealing how they had obtained advance intelligence about the crime. Instead, they would need to create circumstances that appeared to result from routine patrol activities rather than targeted surveillance based on inside information. We'll stage a traffic stop near the target location that will disrupt their timing, Thompson coordinated with Chicago Command. When the robbery team realizes their schedule has been compromised, they'll abort the operation and report back to their contacts in the facility. Sarah can monitor the inmates' reactions to confirm our intelligence network. The plan worked exactly as anticipated. During the afternoon meal service, Sarah observed Rivera receiving news about the failed robbery through a coded conversation with an inmate who had just finished a monitored phone call. The frustration was evident despite their attempts to maintain operational security through their established communication system. The teacher decided not to come to work today, Rivera's contact reported with obvious disappointment. Something about unexpected road construction that blocked the usual route. The whole lesson got canceled, and they're not sure when it can be rescheduled. Sarah translated the coded report in real time. Police activity had disrupted the robbery attempt. The team had been forced to abort the operation, and the organization was now reassessing their security procedures to determine whether their communications had been compromised. More importantly, she observed how the information flowed through the facility's communication network. Within minutes of Rivera receiving the report, coded messages were being passed to inmates throughout the dining hall, alerting the broader organization about the operational failure and potential security concerns. They're implementing damage control procedures, Sarah reported to Thompson via the discrete communication system they had established. Santos is coordinating a security review to determine whether their communication system has been penetrated. They suspect law enforcement may have developed better intelligence capabilities, but they haven't identified the source. The success of preventing the armored car robbery validated Sarah's intelligence analysis while demonstrating the value of her unique position within the facility. However, it also created new challenges as the criminal organization began implementing enhanced security measures to protect their communications from perceived law enforcement surveillance. We have a limited window before they modify their procedures enough to neutralize your access, Thompson warned. Whatever intelligence you can gather over the next few days may be our only opportunity to understand the full scope of their operations before they adapt to counter our capabilities. Sarah understood that her moment of truth had arrived. The unofficial operation that had begun with her personal initiative to gather intelligence had evolved into a federal investigation with the potential to dismantle criminal enterprises throughout the Midwest. The success or failure of everything that followed would depend on her ability to maintain the trust of inmates, who were becoming increasingly suspicious about security breaches in their previously impenetrable communication system. The pressure was enormous, but she also recognized that she had achieved something unprecedented in correctional intelligence gathering. She had gained access to criminal coordination systems that had frustrated law enforcement for years, and she was positioned to provide intelligence that could prevent violence while dismantling organizations that threaten public safety throughout the region. 2 months after Sarah's operation became official, the results exceeded everyone's expectations. The intelligence she had gathered led to coordinated raids across 7 states, resulting in 43 arrests and the seizure of $12 million in assets. The Alvarez organization, which had operated with impunity for over 3 years, had been dismantled through information obtained by a woman who had appeared to be nothing more than a food service worker. The final breakthrough came during a Wednesday morning shift when Santos made a critical mistake that revealed the organization's complete operational structure. Believing his communication system remained secure, he coordinated a comprehensive briefing about upcoming operations that included drug shipments, money laundering activities, and planned retaliations against informants who had cooperated with. Law enforcement. Sarah listened with practiced calm as Santos used basketball tournament brackets to describe distribution territories, discussed family medical appointments that actually detailed assassination targets, and provided weather forecasts that contained specific instructions for criminal activities scheduled throughout the following month. The scope of criminal coordination was staggering, but more importantly, it provided federal prosecutors with evidence needed to pursue RICO charges against the entire organization. The championship game is definitely happening next Friday, Santos explained to a gathering of 6 inmates who represented different criminal enterprises. Our team has been training hard and we're confident about winning the whole tournament. The coach says we should celebrate properly afterward, maybe. Visit some old friends who haven't seen us in a while. Agent Thompson, monitoring through Sarah's discreet recording equipment, immediately recognized that championship game referred to a major drug shipment, training indicated weapons procurement, and visiting old friends meant eliminating witnesses who posed threats to organizational security. The conversation provided actionable intelligence about imminent crimes while documenting the leadership structure that coordinated criminal activities across multiple states. The moment that defined Sarah's transformation from undercover operative to recognized intelligence professional occurred during the final phase of the investigation. Santos had begun suspecting that their communications were being monitored, and he implemented a test designed to identify potential security breaches within their network. He arranged for false information to be shared through different communication channels, with each version containing unique identifying markers that would reveal which source had been compromised if law enforcement acted on the intelligence. Sarah recognized the counterintelligence operation immediately and understood that any response by federal agents would expose her role and potentially endanger everyone involved. Instead of reporting the false information, she maintained complete operational security while gathering additional intelligence about the organization's security procedures and counterintelligence capabilities. Her decision not to act on obvious criminal planning confused Santos, who had expected a law enforcement response that would confirm his suspicions about communication penetration. Maybe we were wrong about the security problems, Santos confided to Mendez during a conversation that Sarah monitored carefully. The information we put out should have triggered raids by now, but nothing happened. Either law enforcement isn't getting our communications, or they're more sophisticated than we thought. Sarah's restraint had prevented exposure of the operation, while actually strengthening her position within the criminal network. The inmates' trust in their communication security was restored, leading them to resume normal coordination activities that provided federal investigators with comprehensive intelligence about ongoing operations. The final phase of arrests began at dawn on a Tuesday morning, with coordinated raids occurring simultaneously across the Midwest. Sarah maintained her normal work schedule, serving breakfast while watching news reports about the massive law enforcement operation that her intelligence had made possible. The inmates gathered around television screens in stunned silence as they recognized associates and family members being arrested in locations throughout their operational territory. "This is impossible," Rivera muttered while watching footage of his girlfriend being arrested at the sporting goods company that served as a money laundering front. Someone had to give them everything. Our whole network is blown, and we don't know how they got our information. Santos studied the television coverage with growing understanding that their organization had been completely penetrated by intelligence sources they had never suspected. Somebody was listening to everything we said. But who? We were careful about communications, monitored all our contacts, and kept operations compartmentalized. Sarah continued serving breakfast with professional composure while internally processing the success of an operation that had exceeded all expectations. The criminal organization that had seemed untouchable 6 months earlier was being systematically dismantled through intelligence she had gathered by simply listening carefully to conversations that occurred in her presence. Warden Crawford appeared in the dining hall entrance, accompanied by Agent Thompson and Detective Kowalski. The sight of federal agents arriving during meal service created immediate tension among inmates who understood that such visits typically preceded additional arrests or facility lockdowns. "Sarah Mitchell," Crawford announced to the dining hall. "Report to the administration office immediately." Every inmate in the facility focused on Sarah as she set down her serving utensils and walked across the dining hall toward the entrance where the law enforcement officials waited. The silence was complete, broken only by the sound of her footsteps on the concrete floor and the low hum of ventilation systems. Santos watched her departure with sudden understanding that transformed his confusion into recognition. "The kitchen lady," he said quietly. She was there for every conversation, every meeting, every coordination session. "We ignored her because we thought she was harmless." The realization spread through the dining hall as inmates processed the implications of having conducted their most sensitive communications in the presence of someone they had dismissed as institutional background. Their operational security had been compromised not by sophisticated surveillance technology or planted informants, but by their own assumptions about who posed threats to their activities. She listened to everything, Mendez confirmed with grudging respect. Every code, every plan, every coordination meeting. We handed her our entire operation because we thought food service staff didn't matter. In Crawford's office, Sarah faced a gathering that included federal prosecutors, intelligence analysts, and corrections administrators who had assembled to recognize her extraordinary contribution to law enforcement. The investigation she had initiated independently had resulted in the largest organized crime prosecution in the region's history. Your intelligence work prevented multiple violent crimes, disrupted criminal enterprises in 7 states, and provided evidence that will keep dangerous individuals incarcerated for decades. U.S. Attorney Rachel Harrison explained while reviewing the scope of prosecutions made possible by Sarah's operation. Agent Thompson presented Sarah with an official commendation from the FBI director, acknowledging her exceptional service to federal law enforcement despite having no official status or authorization when she began gathering intelligence. What you accomplish through individual initiative and professional skill represents intelligence work at the highest level. Detective Kowalski added his department's recognition for her role in preventing the armored car robbery and subsequent violent crimes. You saved lives through your decision to act on intelligence that others might have dismissed as routine conversation. The most meaningful recognition came from Warden Crawford, who offered Sarah a position as intelligence coordinator for the correctional system, with responsibility for developing programs that would identify and counter criminal coordination activities in facilities throughout the state. Your understanding of how criminal organizations operate within correctional environments is unprecedented, Crawford explained. We need someone who can train staff to recognize intelligence opportunities and develop systems for gathering information that protects public safety. Sarah accepted the position, understanding that her success at Riverside had demonstrated possibilities for intelligence gathering that could transform correctional operations throughout the criminal justice system. Her experience had proven that the most valuable intelligence often came from sources that criminals dismissed as harmless, and that systematic attention to communication patterns could reveal criminal coordination that traditional surveillance methods failed to detect. The inmates who had unknowingly provided her with intelligence that dismantled their organization learned a lesson that would influence criminal communication for years to come. Never underestimate someone simply because they don't wear a uniform or carry obvious authority. True intelligence professionals often achieve their greatest successes by remaining invisible until the moment they choose to act on information that Changes everything. Sarah Mitchell had entered Riverside Correctional Complex as an anonymous food service worker. She departed as a recognized intelligence professional whose innovative methods had redefined the possibilities for gathering criminal intelligence in correctional environments, proving that expertise and dedication could transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for protecting public safety. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.